Hey guys, welcome back. I hope that you guys all had a great break and that you enjoyed your time off. Today we are going to be taking some notes. So if you have a printer accessible to you at home, I did include a copy of that in the post today so that you can print those and just fill in the blank. If you did not have access to a printer, that's fine. You're just going to copy these into your notebook, your journal. So you're going to title this Adaptation and Natural Selection. And so this is our new unit that we're starting about all the really cool adaptations that animals have and plants have and that people have due to the process of natural selection. So the guy that first came up with this whole concept is Charles Darwin, and you may have heard of him before. He's known as the father of evolution. He was the first person to realize that natural selection was what helped more fit organisms be able to survive and reproduce. He wrote a very famous book called On the Origin of the Species, a book talking about how he saw natural selection working in the Galapagos Islands and in other places that he studied. Speaking of the Galapagos Islands, Darwin went on a 5-year trip around the world on a boat, a ship called the HMS Beagle. And he was what was called the naturalist. So his job on the ship was to make observations about things that he saw in the natural world, whether it was plants or animals or how different food webs worked, what organisms ate what, where they lived, what role they served in their community, in their little environments. And so he made lots of observations on the Galapagos Islands. And there's several really cool documentaries, if you're into watching documentaries, about the Galapagos Islands and what he found on his adventure. One of the famous things that he was able to study and look at were finches. And finches are a type of bird. And he noticed that even though there were lots of different types of finches with lots of different types of birds, he could put them in categories kind of based off of their beak, because their beaks determined what their diet was. And so beaks that were pointed or square or thicker or thinner all had different types of foods that they were really tailored to eat in that environment. So he started to sketch and document all the different types of beaks on the finches that he saw. And he wrote down information about where they lived, what kind of nests they made, what they ate, all kinds of stuff about their particular environment and their particular type of bird. And you can see in this picture on the screen, there's 4 different types of finches. The number 1 finch has that really thick, large beak, while the number 3 finch looks like it took that beak from number 1 and like minimized it, right? It's really tiny. And then the number 2 beak looks kind of almost like a combination of the number 1 and the number 4 beak. So he noticed these similarities and the differences between these types of birds. And so what he found was that the shape of the beak changed based on what types of food each one ate. So cactus finches were going to have longer beaks that were very pointy so that they could pierce the tough skin of a cactus. And they would be long so they wouldn't get poked by the thorns, right? Ground finches had crushing beaks because they ate seeds that would fall from the trees up top. There were different insect-eating finches, and the insect-eating finches had more tougher beaks, right? Little shorter, tougher beaks, and maybe even one that had like a woodpecker beak where it was longer so they could dig down into those little burrows where the insects would try to get away. They're very pointed because insects are very small, right? And so they could pinch them right up. And so those finches, he noticed, were really similar, but also really different. And so he realized by observing them for a long period of time that they had adapted to their environment. And adapted is just our fancy science word for they had changed and altered their behavior to be able to survive better. Every finch ate a different type of diet, so they occupy a different niche. A niche is just their job or their role in the environment, what they do in the environment, so that there's less competition for specific types of food. So some finches ate seeds and some finches ate insects, and so they weren't competing against each other because the insect-eating birds weren't trying to eat the seeds that the seed-eating birds were. Does that make sense? And so it kind of gave all of the different finches a different role in their particular environment, and that's what we call that niche. So Darwin, after observing not just finches, but also several types of iguanas and tortoises that were on the Galapagos Islands, he wrote this book, The Origin of the Species, and he came up with several points that he believed to be true from the evidence that he saw in nature there. Organisms that survive are the ones that are able to reproduce. If they die because they starve, can't get access to water, there's too much competition for food, whatever the reason, they can't reproduce if they die. So organisms that survive are able to reproduce. His theory also says that resources like food are limited. And so these finches had adapted to eat certain types of foods because of the competition between different finches for food, right? The Galapagos Islands are a very new island, and they are volcanic islands. So they're made from volcanic eruptions underneath the water that eventually get tall enough so that they make an island. Well, there wasn't any life on that island. And so over a series of storms or whatever happened that blew life in, it's a very species poor area. That means there's not a lot of different types of species there, but the species that are there are very diverse because they've adapted and changed in order to better fit their environment. And so they do that because resources like food are limited. There's not insects for all of the birds to eat. So some of the birds started eating seeds, or there weren't seeds for these birds to eat. So some of them started eating insects, right? Because they ate what was available. Birds that adapted, that changed based on their environment, survived. They were able to reproduce and pass on that information to their young, pass on their genes to their young. There's a struggle to survive in nature, right? The fit survive, the healthy survive. There's food, water, protection. All of those things are required for organisms to be able to survive in their environment. And so when there's a struggle, that means there's that competition that we talked about, right? Individual organisms that survive are able to pass on their inherited traits, their traits that they got from their mom and their dad, that in turn allow their offspring to survive better. So, for example, finches that started eating seeds on the forest floor, the ones that were actually able to eat and consume those seeds had beaks that were maybe just a little bit bigger, a little bit stronger so that they could crush those seeds. Well, they reproduce with other birds that have a little bit bigger, a little bit stronger beaks, and they produce babies who have a little bit bigger and a little bit stronger beaks. And over generation to generation, that increases the diversity of that species. It makes the differences bigger. And that's what Darwin saw when he saw all those different types of species or different types of finches who had all these different types of beaks, even though they were the same species, right? They're all finches. They're all these special types of birds. But because of their adaptation to survive in an area that had limited resources, they were able to, over time, inherit traits that were more beneficial from their parents. Variation is that word I use, right, is when we have differences between animals of the same species, right? So, for example, you can have a white peppered moth or you can have a dark peppered moth. You can have variation between humans. You can have lighter skinned humans. You can have darker skinned humans. You can have giraffes with lots of different patterns and shapes to their coat. You can have variation, these differences. You can have different beaks of finches. That's a variation between an animal of the same species, right? It's the same type of organism. It's the same species of organism, but it's a difference, a small variation, a small difference in different animals of a particular species. Evolution is what we call that change. When those things change over time, that's an evolution. That's a change, right? And we see that in a lot of different organisms. Changes happen and we can see them. In fact, there are some examples of elephants and how they're adapting in certain areas of Africa where they have been poached a lot. Natural selection has meant that elephants who have large tusks oftentimes are poached and they are killed. And so an evolution has happened in those elephants because now they're reproducing, and the elephants that are able to survive are elephants that don't naturally have tusks. And so tuskless elephants are becoming more common. That evolution, that change is happening because of natural selection, because of organisms that are able to survive. The tuskless elephants are able to reproduce, while the elephants who had tusks oftentimes are poached or killed for their tusks. They're not able to reproduce as much because there's not as many of them. Natural selection, that's that word I just used. That's when nature decides who's the fittest, right? Who's the healthiest? And those are the ones who reproduce, right? It's not an actual decision. It's more of a survival of the fittest, right? If you've ever watched Survivor, right, or any show where they're trying to survive in a particular environment that may be tougher than normal, the characteristics or the characters in those shows that are strong survive, right? They win challenges. They proceed through the competition. And that's the same for natural selection. Healthy characteristics get passed down from a parent to their offspring, and that increases their chances of survival. Sometimes even mutations happen to their genes that are helpful to them, that allow them to survive better. And then those mutations are passed on to offspring, which allow them to survive better. And so natural selection is that process that happens in nature because of competition, because of limited resources, that organisms that are the most fit, the most healthy, the most able to survive and reproduce are the ones that are able to survive and reproduce. And that makes their young have those same characteristics because a lot of traits are inherited. Changes over time that allow some organisms to survive when others can't are called adaptations. And there's a really easy example to show how quickly sometimes adaptations can happen. In the early 1850s, there were in forests a lot of lichen, which is in the picture that's on the right with the black moth. There was lichen that covered a lot of trees in European forests. Well, when the Industrial Revolution started, of course, there was a lot of coal being burned, and that coal in the air killed some of the lichens that grew on the trees. And so those trees were showing their bark that was actually there underneath where those lichens were growing on top. And so there were peppered moths that lived in these forests. And before the 1850s, during the Industrial Revolution, the peppered moths were almost exclusively white, right? They were white with spots because they blended in very good along the white trunks of the trees, right? It was speckled like the moth that you see in the left picture against the black trunk. Now, over time, after the Industrial Revolution started and coal was being burned, not only did it not allow those lichens and fungi to grow on the trees that made it light in color, but it also kind of covered them in soot sometimes. And so it gave a darker appearance to the trunks of the trees. So then the birds that eat the moths were very easily able to find the white moths and gobble them up for lunch and dinner and breakfast. And so in a very short period of time, the moths that were able to survive and reproduce were the darker moths, no longer the light moths who were able to blend in against the light forest. And so in the light forest, the light moths were able to blend in. In a dark forest, the dark moths were able to blend in. And we're actually going to do a little web quest about this next week. And it's a very interesting period of time in a way that we were able to see natural selection very quickly happen in action. An adaptation, like we just said, is a structure or a behavior that helps an organism to survive in its environment. And all of the things pictured in the screen here are showing you something that helps them to survive in its environment, right? These organisms have things that allow them to adapt and survive, or they're adaptations that have allowed them to survive and reproduce in their environment. Obviously, you can see our little fox over here is light colored, and so it helps him to blend in, right? We've got a school of fish. They travel in packs so that they can try to survive and reproduce. Porcupine quills help to protect themselves, right? Excuse me. All of those things that you see pictured are things that help them survive in their environment. Selective breeding is kind of the opposite of natural selection. It's when humans choose what characteristics they want in a particular species, and they breed those characteristics into the offspring. So let's say they want a dog with long hair, right? So they've bred longer-haired versions, longer-haired variations of a species over and over again to get a long-haired variation of a dog. Same thing with dogs that were bred for hunting. You may have heard, dachshunds were bred for hunting. That's why they've got these long, skinny bodies so that they could get into the small burrows of rabbits and foxes. Different dogs were bred for certain reasons, and over a period of time, they developed characteristics based on the variations that were selected by each species or each organism in that species. So here's another example. Here in Texas, obviously cattle farming is a big thing, right? And so when we're looking at animals that we want to be able to survive, there has been selective breeding of cattle. So the Brahman cattle have a good resistance to heat, but the meat's not that great. And then the English shorthorn cattle, they had good beef, but they couldn't live in the heat. Well, when we pick those two and we combine them, we breed them together, we get a different breed of cattle, a Santa Gertrudis cattle. And the result is they have good beef and they can tolerate the heat. So this is an example of how we can use selective breeding to increase production of even things like food. That's where we've gotten chickens that now weigh 10 pounds, where chickens maybe in the 30s and 40s weighed 5 or 6 pounds. And so we've over time bred consistently the largest chickens. We want them to have the babies because they pass on those large genes to their offspring, and then we can breed large babies together and get even bigger chickens. And so it's the way that we are able to produce enough food so that we can sustain the number of people that we have on our planet. Here's kind of an example of how different dogs kind of came to be, right? Dogs are derived from wolves. And so over time, we've got these all different shapes and sizes of dogs that all came from this common wolf-like ancestor. And so, you know, in different cultures, different things were desirable and looked after and bred those variations of that species over and over again to get that more sought after appearance or characteristic. All right, we are going to stop here. This is where we're going to pick up next time. So I hope you guys have a fantastic day today, and I'll see you tomorrow.